This video is structured as follows. First, I will briefly introduce myself. Then, I will proceed by giving you an example lecture. My name is Elena Shadrina. I am an associate professor at the School of International Liberal Studies, SILS, at WASEDA University. My background is in economics. The latest and the highest degree I earned is a PhD in economics. Before joining SILS at WASEDA in April 2017, I taught at Temple University, followed by Major University, where I was responsible for a range of economic disciplines. At SILS, among my principal courses are Russian language for beginners, Introduction to Russian Studies, Contemporary Political Economy of Russia, Economy of Russia, Historical and Modern Perspectives, Comparative Economics and Institutional Design, and others. My research interests include energy governance with application of theoretical frameworks of new institutional economics and new comparative economics, natural resources, energy, economic growth and development, energy policy and political economy of conventional, such as oil and gas, and renewable energy in Eurasia and Northeast Asia. My example lecture is entitled The Fall of the Soviet Union, Causes and Consequences. In the assessment of Professor of History at the London School of Economics, Vladislav Zubok, the collapse of the Soviet Empire was an event of epochal, geopolitical, military, ideological and economic significance. Was it indeed such a momentous event? And if so, what exactly made it such? Shortly after the actual event took place, there were various attempts to examine this theme. Nowadays, the interest in this study almost disappeared, although our comprehension of this event remains incomplete, to say the least. In my model lecture, I intend to shed some light on the causes and consequences of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In doing so, I will address the following questions. What kind of country was the Soviet Union? Why did the Soviet Union collapse? And what are the consequences of the Soviet Union demise? The Soviet Union was established in 1922 and went through several enlargements, as we would say nowadays, in 1924, 1929 and 1940. The foundation of the Soviet Union was preceded by the Great October Revolution of 1970, which took place in Russia's then capital city called Petrograd, these days known as St. Petersburg, and the Civil War, which for about 4 years embraced the entire Russia. It will not be an exaggeration to assess that the dominant political party of Bolsheviks, founded upon the communist ideology and led by Vladimir Ulyanov Lenin, was the force behind the creation of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union as we commonly call it. The Soviet Union was a union of 14 Soviet Socialist Republics and 1 Soviet Socialist Federative Republic, Russia. The Soviet Union was the largest country by its territory and extremely diverse in terms of cultural, linguistic, as well as religious aspects. Yet, the latter was not prominent under the dominance of communist ideology. Although the constitution declared that the republics could leave the Union, in practice, the governance, which was underpinned by the Communist Party leadership, was absolutely centralized. In a sense, the Soviet Union was a grandiose project designed by the Soviet communists, whose concern was to demonstrate to the rest of the world the supremacy of communism as an ideological platform and the superiority of the socialist economy organized through central administrative planning. It's undeniable that the Soviet Union succeeded with the tremendous task of developing a huge territory, which literally underwent a complete transformation from an agricultural to industrial society through the party-drawn programs of electrification, collectivization, and industrialization. Nevertheless, it cannot be forgotten that the implementation of these growth programs cost Soviet people an unacceptably high price of many human lives and large social tragedies. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader in 1924-1953, is largely responsible for enforcing economic transformations with coercion and endorsing political repressions against those people who disagreed with him about the methods or the speed of socialist transformations. To an extent, thus, economic achievements were ensured upon the reliance on free labor of political prisoners in forced labor camps across the Soviet Union. This system of camps, called Gulag, existed in 1930-1956, and even it inflicted profound wounds on the Soviet and even contemporary Russian society. It's assessed that about 2 million Soviet people died in Gulag. There is a great piece by a Nobel laureate Soviet Russian novelist, historian and human rights activist, and himself a former Gulag prisoner, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, about Gulag, called the Gulag Archipelago. The Soviet economy was based upon state ownership. There was absolutely no private property rights. The economic system of the Soviet Union was centrally planned, which means that all decisions about what, in what quantities to produce, and at what price to sell were made by the central planning authorities and sent to the state-owned enterprises to be fulfilled in time. The planning period was 5 years. So-called Soviet competition among the enterprises to fulfill the tasks of a 5-year plan ahead of time became one of the important Soviet traditions. A winner of the competition would be commanded and awarded a certificate and a title of the winner of a socialist competition. Additional pay, monetary awards as such, were not practiced as a stimulus for hard work. Moral incentives were believed to be the most appropriate way to inspire a Soviet builder of communism for higher achievements. The Communist Party pursued a task of building a society where every citizen would have equal social and economic rights. The health care, school, vocational and higher education, housing and the likes were absolutely free of charge. The Soviet people were guaranteed work. For instance, right upon their graduation from educational institutions, they were dispatched to designated enterprises. In a sense, there was a lifetime employment system, with the difference being that people could not choose the place of their first employment. They first needed to work for 2 years at a designated place. The logic was such that if the education is free, the young specialist shall first work with the state who enabled their education decides to dispatch them to. At a certain time, there was even a tax on those who did not want to work. However, the principles of equality would also mean that regardless of their performance, the employees would be treated nearly equal in terms of their wage, salary, thus demotivating capable workers to fully utilize their skills and preventing any individual initiative for higher productivity and efficiency at the workplace. In these principal features, we can easily identify the weak points of the Soviet economic system, although the Soviet Union was successful in many fields. For example, it launched the first manned with Yuri Gagarin on board satellite into space on April 12, 1961. December 25 of 1991 became the date of the official dissolution of the USSR. In a sense, this was not a completely sudden turn. Long before that, there were numerous signs of the weakening position of the Soviet Union. In the 50s and 60s, there were attempts by some socialist economists in Europe to change their economic systems. But the Soviet Union was the principal force that, in a variety of ways, prevented the beginning of those drifts away from socialism. When in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev initiated perestroika in the Soviet Union, the expectations for significant changes have risen. The Baltic republics, Georgia and Azerbaijan. At that time, the Soviet republics within the USSR were especially hopeful about gaining their independence. Yet, only few could foresee the imminent disintegration of such a gigantic in terms of its territory country as Soviet Union was. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989 resulted in the official reunification of the East and West Germany, was a trigger for igniting the anti-Soviet movements in Eastern European countries, such as Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and others, and driving deeper separations within the Soviet Union. Speaking of the causes of their eventual demise of the Soviet Union, we would introduce several principal positions on this account. Although there are more versions varying in detail, we will present three primary views. Thus, the first version emphasizes the role of the recent national democratic movement in the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, and Caucasus, Georgia and Azerbaijan. However, this view does not have many supporters because it's a known fact that President Gorbachev was prepared to modify the terms of the Soviet Republic's membership in the Soviet Union. To that end, the new Union Treaty was prepared in 1991. Many experts assess that the draft document allowed the new republics far more independence than, for example, the terms of the Baltic states' current membership in the European Union. The second version suggests that the collapse of the Soviet Union was induced by an anti-communist sentiment which was inspired by the political views and activity of Boris Yeltsin, who became president of the Russian Federation Republic, at that time still one of the 15 Soviet republics. Yeltsin was able to consolidate non-communist forces around himself, thereby preventing ultra-nationalistic or military developments, which could set the Soviet Union onto a Yugoslavia-like scenario. The third theory, which has more advocates, says that the demise of the Soviet Union had purely economic origin. In other words, the Soviet economy, with its low productivity and efficiency, was predestined to die because it has simply exhausted its internal potential for sustaining extensive growth. Attempting to revive the Soviet economy in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev initiated socio-economic transformation under the slogan of "ускорение" or acceleration. However, those were attempts to solve the most acute problems of Soviet economy without challenging the foundations of the socialist economic system. There were, for instance, changes aiming to improve motivation of workers of state-owned enterprises, for which economic accounting, implying self-financing, self-re-evaluation, and self-management were experimented with. The Soviet enterprises were permitted to run foreign trade and even investment transactions with the partners outside the socialist bloc, with firms from Western Europe and America. In order to activate economic initiative of the Soviet citizens, the cooperatives were endorsed, employment at which became the first real alternative to work at a state-owned enterprise. There were also attempts to crack down on corruption and alcoholism. Massive campaign for the termination of production and consumption of alcohol, called Dry Law, was launched in 1985. Soon it became clear that the problems of Soviet economy require a more comprehensive approach, and in 1987, perestroika, restructuring of political and economic system, was launched. Glasnost or openness, a forerunner of democracy, became one of the important components of perestroika. So, in the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was seeing economic, social, and political transformations, which, however, did not mean to challenge the values of socialist economic system and communism. The reality was such that even relatively shallow transitions caused the irreversible tensions between the elements of socio-economic and political system of the Soviet Union. Instead of attempted economic revitalization, the Soviet economy continued to decline at even a faster pace. Between 1989 and 1991, the gross national product of the Soviet Union shrunk by 20%. On top of that, by the late 1980s, profoundly dependent on oil exports, the Soviet economy was deeply affected by the drop in world oil prices. The living standards of the ordinary Soviet citizens became far from being satisfactory, as people experienced severe deficit of grocery and other necessities and were forced to stand in long lines in order to purchase any of scarce supplies. Thus, various piecemeal reforms which were meant to liberalize and revitalize the Soviet economy only divided the interests of various groups: Communist Party nomenclatura, government bureaucrats, directors of state-owned enterprises, ordinary citizens, and so on, leading to the unraveling of the socio-economic and political fabric of a system founded upon centralized control and undermining core institutions of the Soviet economy. Yet, in September 1990, the president of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, rejected a more radical economic reform plan called 500 Days, developed by a young economist and politician, Grigory Yavlinsky, and others. The aggravated socio-economic situation in the Soviet Union deepened the split not only among economic reformers but political forces in the Soviet Union. By 1991, Gorbachev lost even that thin support he initially had with his party fellows and citizens. In August 1991, coup d'etat was an attempt of their anti-reform forces to restore the authority of the Communist Party and return to the Soviet-style economic management system. After the coup failed, 10 republics declared their independence, thereby de facto ending the Soviet Union. The President Gorbachev no longer had real authority. Even in Moscow, his position was challenged by Boris Yeltsin. On December 8, 1991, the heads of three nations, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, gathered in Belovezha, Belarus, and signed an agreement on the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States. This manifested the end of the Soviet Union. On December 21, 1991, the heads of 11 nations, except Georgia and the Baltic republics, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, met in Almaty, Kazakhstan, to sign the Almaty Protocol, which confirmed the dissolution of the Union and formally established the Commonwealth of Independent States. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to formally exist. It seems to be accurate to suggest that the Gorbachevian reforms galvanized the dismantling of the Soviet economy, but it seems to be equally accurate to propose that the end of the Soviet Union was inevitable, even at the absence of such reforms. What are the consequences of the Soviet Union demise? Moving on to our final question, the dismantling of the Soviet Union created manifold effects on global security and world economy. Describing the most significant consequences in no specific order, the dissolution of the Soviet Union resulted in the emergence of the 15 new sovereign nation states, which, along with the former socialist economies of Eastern Europe, made the global economy more diverse and dynamic. Importantly, the breakup of the Soviet Union ended the Cold War, terminated the exhausting arms race, and put to rest the ideological confrontations. All of this opened new opportunities for domestic economic growth and international cooperation. Yet, the collapse of the Soviet Union created a new security landscape. four nuclear powers, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, appeared on the scene. At the early stage of market reforms, in the environment of deteriorating socio-economic situations in these transition economies, there are significant concerns whether these nations are able to ensure proper control over their nuclear materials and technologies or not. The demise of the Soviet Union changed the power balance, but unfortunately the end of the Cold War confrontation did not eliminate the ambitions of some states and alliances to dominate. For a certain time, the bipolar system transformed into a unipolar one, but very quickly it started to reshape through the enlargement of the existing alliances. For instance, the Baltic states, along with some Eastern European countries, became new members of the NATO. This precipitated the post-Soviet states into creation of new security structures. The Collective Security Treaty was established in 1992, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was launched in 2001. This can be interpreted as a move to create a multipolar system. In a broader context, following the termination of the Soviet Union, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, 5 nations in Central Asia, 3 in Caucasus, and 3 in the Baltic Sea region have opted for different scenarios for their economic integration. Thus, the Baltic states joined the European Union, while Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia eventually created the Eurasian Economic Union. There are various regional and international economic associations involving the post-Soviet states. The end of the Soviet Union gave start to market reforms in majority of post-Soviet economies. Initially, market transitions were supervised by the IMF and the World Bank, in line with the then popular principles of Washington Consensus. But as transition economies build up their own financing capacities and expertise, they opted for independent economic policy making, away from one-fits-all approach. The majority of the post-Soviet economies have chosen to participate in economic globalization via the accession to the IMF, World Bank, WTO, and other international organizations. Thus, we had a rather cursory overview of one of the phenomena of the 20th century, the inception and the collapse of the Soviet Union. I hope that this video inspired you to learn more about Russia as a post-Soviet and former socialist economies in Europe. If so, I invite you to sign up for my classes of Russian studies, comparative economics, and other courses where I address the relevant themes. Please check SEAL syllabus for more information.